Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is described as a leading contemporary architect of mind-body medicine. He's melded harmoniously together the teaching of ancient traditions with modern science, quantum physics in particular. He's authored more than 36 books that have been translated in at least an equal number of languages. He's produced more than 100 audio, video, CD-ROMs and a host of materials to further his ideas and philosophy. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Deepak Chopra.
Thanks for
welcome
having
to the
me,
program.
Rajiv.
Amongst your more recent bestsellers, and I think virtually all your books are bestsellers, has been How to Know God. Why is it important in this sort of empirical age to know God?
Well, as human beings, we are the only species on this planet that ask questions like, where did I come from? What am I doing here? Is there any meaning or purpose to my existence? Do I have a soul? What happens to me after I die? Does God exist? And if God exists, does he or she or it even care about me? After all, planet Earth is a speck of dust in a relatively minor galaxy. Our sun has 300 other billion stars. Andromeda galaxy just next door has another 300 million, and we are part of 6 billion galaxies. So is there any point to our existence? You can either kind of resolve into an existential dilemma and be nihilistic, or you can say that in fact the world is structured in a self-organizing process that must involve consciousness. For 300 years, we've been wedded to a materialistic worldview where we've said, understand the behavior of molecules and you'll understand everything, including consciousness. So consciousness is a product of your brain, just like bile is a product of your gallbladder and hydrochloric acid is a product of your stomach. But actually, that worldview is dead. Right now, the reductionist worldview is on its deathbed. We are seeing the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism, even through our technology. The fact that people can watch us right now, that's based on a very fundamental premise in science, and that is that the essential nature of the material world is that it's not material. The essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. It's non-stuff, and a lot of scientists are saying it's thinking non-stuff, and I think there's a lot of evidence that that's the case.
So, what form does this God take for you beyond? Obviously, you've described it as the superstitious material world. You've talked about consciousness. What form structure does God take?
You just stated it by using the word form. God is formless. As soon as you have form, you have defined a limitation to an ineffable, unbounded, eternal, acausal, atemporal reality that exists is outside of the boundaries of space-time and causation. So God has no form. But the form that God takes is the universe. In Vedanta, God is Brahman, and the world, the universe, is Brahmand. So the form is the universe itself, of which a human being is a particular pattern of behavior in that universal form.
Yet we tend to use, we're circumscribed by our conceptual skills, our vocabularies, to try and make sense of this. So if I could take you further, is this God in the sense of a creator God? And if there is a creator God, why is there so much human suffering? There are a whole sort of range of questions that follow from the assumption, the conclusion, the belief that there is God.
If you can conceptualize God, then that's not God. If you can imagine God, that's not God. Anything that you can conceptualize, imagine, visualize, perceive is not really the real reality.
So that's
but all of
this,
it's neti-neti. But all of it depends on something that you can't conceptualize. Because without consciousness, you can't conceptualize. Without consciousness, you can't visualize. Without consciousness, you can't perceive. So God is consciousness that conceives, governs, constructs, and becomes physical form, all physical form. Why is there suffering? Well, God is both creator and destroyer. God is the expression of the creativity that you see inherent in the universe. God is also the forces of nature that maintain the integrity of the universe.
Is God benevolent?
Not necessarily. God, our experience of God, the forces of creativity are always ahead of the forces of destruction, because otherwise there wouldn't be any evolution. But as has been elegantly stated, a permanently victorious anything, including a permanently victorious species, risks its own distinction. So if God was all good and benevolent, God would risk his or her own extinction as well. The many faces of God are the infinite expressions of creativity, entropy, disorder, destruction, and maintenance. Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwara.
So you have taught and worked extensively in the United States and in Western cultures, where we have still been governed largely by the pursuit of happiness. As the goal, as the desirable end to all sort of human striving. So where does this pursuit of happiness coexist, reconcile itself with the notion of a God that permits the entire range of experience and emotions?
The pursuit of happiness is an illusion. Happiness, or an innate sense of fulfillment, is the nature of your soul or your spirit. And if you ground yourself and anchor yourself and have that as your internal reference point, then happiness is in the moment. It's life-centered, present moment awareness, which is the only reality, where the future is still in imagination, the past is also in memory. But since this moment is real, if you have your attention grounded in this, then you will be content. Hopefully not too content, because if you are totally content, then you're doomed for senility. You have to have that divine discontent as well in order to move into the expressions of your own creativity. Happiness is not around the corner and is something that remains ever elusive if you pursue.
You're in Delhi conducting a workshop on leadership, and some of the reports already talk about you debunking the myth that leaders are actually made and they're not born.
I think leadership is a skill. Just like riding a bike is a skill, or learning to play music. You may have some tendencies, innate tendencies, but ultimately leadership is knowing what people need and how to respond to those needs. We have, as human beings, fundamental needs like survival and safety, and basic needs like food and shelter. But beyond that, we have the need for achievement, the need to belong, the need for love, the need for self-esteem, the need for creative expression, self-actualization. I think if you're an effective leader, you should be able to ask yourself, what am I observing right now? What am I feeling? What's the need here? And what's the best way to respond to this need? And that's a skill that can be taught.
But leadership is perceived to be something that's desperately lacking, say, in the political sphere in most parts of the world. You have also sort of suggested that people, a cliche, but you've elaborated on it, that people pretty much get the leadership they deserve. Where does the catalyst for change come from? Where does it happen? We begin to change ourselves and then wait for a leader to come in that will adequately represent us?
I think a leader is in fact the collective soul of a group consciousness, and very frequently emerges in times of turbulence when things have reached rock bottom, and also represents the collective yearning of a particular soul, a group soul, you might say. So a Martin Luther King emerges and says, I have a dream, because it's the dream of a collective consciousness. Or a Mahatma Gandhi emerges, or a Nelson Mandela emerges, or an Oscar Arias emerges, or a Gorbachev emerges. They are products of the situations and circumstances and events and the confluence of relationships that are expressing themselves at a particular time. And so leadership is something that spontaneously emerges in times when there is the need for an ecosystem, a social ecosystem, to evolve to a new stage of its creativity. But I think by understanding this process, we can accelerate the evolution of leaders. And I think if we focus on younger people who are not so sucked into the hypnosis of social conditioning, where leadership right now is about power mongering, influence peddling, cronyism, and essentially corruption, all in the name of leadership.
You are a leader in your own field, in the area that you work. To what degree do you sort of consciously calibrate yourself to meet the ideals of leadership that you've been talking about, or the principles of it? Is it something that spontaneously happens?
It happens spontaneously, but I am very conscious of the fact that I have to be a good listener, and that I have to listen to the audience that I'm speaking to, and not only just listen through the instrument of the flesh in terms of being a good observer, but with the heart and the soul, that I have to somehow connect with people, and I understand the process of emotional bonding. I also constantly ask myself, am I aware of the context in which this is happening? And besides that, I also focus on being action oriented, because otherwise it's only philosophy. I also believe that you can't be a leader unless you empower other people, that you can't take it on all yourself. And I believe in the magical ingredients of synchronicity and, the good luck factor and all that.
So how much of this is sort of retrospective analysis of the way you are and the way you have emerged, and then it's a sharing of experiences, and how much of that is strategized consciously?
It's reflective mostly. It's not strategized consciously. Now I'm beginning to articulate it as a result of having this process of reflective inquiry, if nothing else. But I think that's how all things happen. You understand the process. I pay a lot of credit to the practice of meditation. When I practice even now 2 hours of meditation, I've done it for 30 years, and one of the things that meditation does is it results in the proliferation of ambiguity in your consciousness. You experience these waves of possibility, and they get vaguer and vaguer, and then suddenly a pattern emerges out of that. And that's in fact the whole process I use for writing my books as well.
So what form of meditation do you do? I mean, you were at one point trained by and with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and then the TM principle is to work with this mantra just to keep making it more and more subtle, and then
I very much think that mantra meditation with seed mantras, or bij mantras as they're called, is a very effective way of actually causing that proliferation of ambiguity and uncertainty in your consciousness, and ultimately taking you to a place of deep silence. But over the years I've focused on breath awareness, mindfulness, everything else, but still stuck to my roots in Bij Mantra meditation as taught by Maharishi.
But thus the system of meditation, it seems and is inevitably appears to be circumscribed by belief. If you have the Bija mantras are associated with chakras and are associated with deities. To what degree can meditation be a purely secular activity?
I think it is a secular activity. The deities are actually symbolic expressions of expanded states of our own consciousness. They symbolically represent certain dormant potentialities that are existing in your own consciousness. And I think a lot of the real essence of Vedantic knowledge, which wasn't belief, which wasn't ideology, which was pretty much process oriented and very mechanical in terms of its disciplines, got in a sense corrupted into belief and dogma. And I think what I've realized over the years, as I've delved very deeply into the literature of the Upanishads and some of the great commentators who were people like Krishnamurti and others, that actually there was a lot of wisdom in all of that, and it wasn't belief, it wasn't dogma, it was a technology for going inward more than anything else.
You mentioned Krishnamurti, and yet Krishnamurti is someone who in a sense debunks technology of sort of structured processes and approaches.
He was so evolved, he didn't see the necessity for ordinary people like me or others to actually use technology or processes. You're right about that. Krishnamurti also had this great cynicism for people who didn't understand him. I took it upon myself to not only understand Krishnamurti, but promise myself I'd explain him better than he could himself.
In terms of your exposure to the scriptures, to the rich Indian heritage of writing, not just Indian, you're inspired by Rumi and sort of other Eastern traditions and philosophies too. To what degree does that represent empirical knowledge that you assimilate? Do you test it against experience yourself? How sacred, how sacrosanct is it?
It's not sacred or sacrosanct at all. I mean, I will be very selective in what I look at, even in literature like the Bhagavad Gita, because, you know, if you read carefully through the Bhagavad Gita, you'll find cows and women in the same category in certain places. And there are certain things that I would not be comfortable with. So I'm very selective in what I take from Sufism or Vedanta or the sacred, so-called sacred literatures. I think they were literatures that were really channeled in a sense by human nervous systems, and human nervous systems are imperfect, including mine. So you have to just take everything that you understand to be intuitively feeling right for you and see if it has any practical applications. But what I do experience myself is, as I read a lot of this literature, I get insights into interpretations which at the moment feel very unique to me, but I don't know if they're unique at all.
You know, one of the ways that we were talking about God, to sort of pursue, realize the spiritual or the nature of consciousness is to look at coincidences, synchronicity. In what ways do you make this connection?
You know, through perceptual experience, we experience a material world where we see linear cause-effect relationships. But the fact is, if you look deeply into nature, then everything is, in a sense, synchronistic. Why do fireflies in the hundreds of thousands flash on-off signals synchronistically? Why do crickets chirp synchronistically? Why do birds in flight move synchronistically? Why do the pacemaker cells in your heart, 100,000 of them, fire synchronistically? Your brain cells phase and frequency lock in synchronistically. That's one type of synchronicity. There's another type of synchronicity where disparate events in space and time somehow synchronize into purposeful activity. So how does a human body, which has 100 trillion cells, each cell doing 6 trillion things per second, actually synchronistically orchestrate its activity? Because a human body can think thoughts, play a piano, kill germs, remove toxins, and make a baby all at the same time. And whilst it's doing that, it synchronistically tracks the movement of the planets, because your biological rhythms are actually the symphony of the stars. Today, we have an understanding, a mathematical understanding of what this is, that there is a fundamental level in nature where everything is synchronistically connected to everything else. Technically, it's called acausal, atemporal, non-local, quantum mechanical interrelatedness, where events in disparate locations in space-time influence each other without the exchange of energy or information signals. When Einstein first proposed this as the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen equation, he didn't believe in it himself. And then John Bell confirmed it mathematically, and today we have experimental proof of what we call this phenomenon. You know, but in spiritual traditions, you would call this omniscience. You would call this omnipresence. How do events in different locations communicate without sending energy or information signals? So, you know, again, going back to Vedanta, Atman is Brahman, there's a fundamental level of existence within yourself that is part of the field of consciousness where all this happens, where space-time and causality synchronistically orchestrate their activity. So in my book, what I've done is I've taken some of the very fundamental behavior tenets, behavioral tenets and internal shifts in consciousness to actually orchestrate synchronicity and coincidence. Co means several, incidents. So coincidence means several incidents happening simultaneously. Chronos is time. Synchronos also means synchronized in time. And I have actually looked at the writings of Carl Jung, who talked about synchronicity as part of the collective unconscious, and his friend Wolfgang Pauli, who was a physicist, who spoke of meaningful correspondence and said, you know, synchronicity is a momentary glimpse into the mind of God. That's what
you demonstrate a remarkable erudition across the whole spectrum of disciplines and specializations. What techniques do you use to recollect all this and to remember this? It's your legend for being able to recall any scene or act from any of Shakespeare's plays. What is the secret of this?
I don't know. I think I really don't understand myself. As I was telling you before we started, I have this fear that it'll stop coming. But right now, I feel like there's some unknown factor that channels itself through my consciousness, and I just seem like a scribe, like Ganesh was the scribe for.
So, what form does this voice take? Do you hear it? Is it automatic writing? How does it process itself through you?
It comes to me as insights, and sometimes it comes to me as very clear expressions. And the Shakespeare thing is different. I used to actually act in Shakespearean plays at one time, so I could be Hamlet one night and Macbeth and the next, and Julius Caesar the next, and I loved it. And I'm also, very compulsive and obsessive about anything that has to do with consciousness. So it's part of it is probably just the fact that I'm neurotic or something.
You've described yourself as a spiritual vagabond, and you're obviously someone who, even though you surrender to the processes of flow, you also work very hard at being who you are and what you are and the contributions that you make. But a criticism of your approach might well be that this whole tradition of sadhana, of effort, is in some senses lost and diluted in the programs that you run and in what you offer to the community. The possibility of sort of a quick, instant insight transformation.
Well, I'm a physician by training, and I was used to writing prescriptions. And I later realized that my audiences were very much wanting a prescription, so I got into the habit of being very prescriptive. And in the culture that I'm now in, I think that works very effectively. That people given a prescription, a small segment will be compliant and will in fact make a difference in their lives. At the same time, I understand that that's not really the key to freedom, because the prescription itself becomes very binding. So it's a kind of a thin line to walk on. But yeah, I've been very prescriptive. The 7 spiritual laws of success, how to know God, etc. And maybe it's because I'm a physician, I used to write letters to my wife, and she couldn't read them. She used to take them to the pharmacist who used to read my prescriptions. So it's an old habit.
You've also begun recently, or relatively recently, to look at larger social issues and dimensions beyond personal healing, personal transformation. You're, with Oscar Arias and several other people, you've created this initiative for the shift of global consciousness. Shift in global consciousness.
Yeah, it sounds very ambitious, no? But there's a phenomenon in ecosystems and in biological forms called emergence. If you have enough people with the same vision and the same purpose, and enough diversity in an ecosystem, as in, say, biodiversity in an ecosystem, then very spontaneously something emerges out of that, which is not predicted by the qualities of the components. It's a new creative leap, or it's an attribute that you never thought you would see, and it surprises you. And so, as I looked across NGOs throughout the world in the areas of social justice, ecology, economics, conflict resolution, I said, there are so many of them, and why isn't there a change? And then the idea occurred, maybe we should connect them. So we are becoming a network of networks, and we are ambitiously calling it the awakening of the neural networks of the new planetary mind, with the hope that something creative will emerge from this, because right now the world seems polarized and to ideologies by really a revival of religious fundamentalism, which is very dangerous.
You know, Deepak Chopra has evolved from a physician at AIMS through so many layers of growth, evolution, and discovery. Does he have any sense of where he might be 10 years from now?
Well, what's the Chinese saying? A good traveler has no plans, no definite plans, and is not intent on arriving. So I'm just going to stay a good traveler.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Dr.
Rajiv.
It's been a
Thank
great
you very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.